Hey Tim, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yes, working in South London and been locked in for 3 weeks and doing fine on it, I must say.
You're looking well on it. I'm pleased to hear that it's not going too badly in these surreal times. Um, we're, we're starting the films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and to give us an overview of their work. So would you mind doing that for us, please?
Yeah, happy to. It's something I'll probably, as we go through for this hour, you'll probably find me qualifying lots of my statements because that's the kind of, in a way, what I do is stuff which I feel like I'm always in the process of qualifying.
Mm.
Um, I was thinking about this in the shower this morning, starting off with an I am a whatever. And I kind of have problems with thinking about I am a this or that. As a teacher, that's one of the things I am. As a teacher, I always kind of say to students, well, this is one way of thinking about things, but there are other ways. Um, I was thinking about saying I'm a poet, and then I thought, well, I've got a book of collaborations, artistic kind of creations with my daughter. I've got a photo book, written a play, written a couple of novels. So, what are you? I'm a poet. I started off being serious as a writer, being in love with poetry, reading tons and tons of poetry. So, I guess, what am I? I'm a poet. Um, I did some kind of CV type assessment a few months back and discovered I'd written 26 books,
Wow.
yeah, I said something like wow as well. I'm still not quite sure how I have, but I seem to have written 26 books. I'm 57, so um, on one level, that's I suppose about reasonable for someone my age. Um,
I think it is. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, I might, in total, they've probably sold about 58 copies. And that's okay too, because poets, we're not in it for the movie rights and all the rest of it. Yeah, my books, I'm proud of the fact that my books have been published in the United States. I was first published in the States, in France, in Canada, um, in anthologies in Mexico and Chile. I kind of, I'm clearly an English person, for better or worse. Um, I think of myself as being a poet and creative artist who's part of a international, global community of readers. And I think part of my practice is doing translation. It's a weird kind of translation in that I'm not fluent in any other languages. My biggest, fattest book, which I guess probably has sold the most copies, is kind of creative translations of the Italian poet Petrarch. I don't read Italian, um, and and that's okay. That's kind of the joy of being in part a translator for me. Um, the kind of business in the way I started saying I'm not quite sure who I am. I want to resist kind of definition. Um, I'm a Buddhist, and being a practicing Buddhist is a really important part of my daily, thinking, being on the planet. And again, kind of Buddhist concepts of emptiness. Uh, they tie in with literary concepts of negative capability. About writers or humans kind of being in doubt, humans being defined by relationships, by how other people see them. That goes to, I guess, the death of the author kind of ideas as well, and it's the reader that is getting meaning. And so, although I'm clearly some kind of producer of works and meanings, I'm really not interested in saying there is a particular meaning that people are to get from what I say or do. How am I doing? That's the end of my first response.
It's great. So you're a producer of meanings, but not a controller of meanings, if I got that right.
I would say so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Can you? There's an awful lot for us to unpack there and think about. if we start with kind of the last thing you said, could you unpack for us a bit more that relationship between a Buddhist investment in and celebration of empty spaces, if I've got that right, as against the kind of literary idea of humans being in doubt? I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, they kind of go together in that clearly we're doing a kind of speed dating version of Buddhism and literary theory, which is the best kind, arguably. That in Buddhism, the idea that one has an independent existence is disagreed with. Everything exists through, so you say, my being proves the existence of the sun, or the sun proves the existence of me because the sun the trees grow and then the planet is created and there is oxygen. And so the interdependence of being, in which one is always determined by one's relationship to what is around you. There's also a kind of cosmological model called Indra's net, in which there is the universe consists of a vast net, and in each knot where the ropes of the net meet, there is a jewel which reflects every other jewel in every other part of the net. And so everything is always that kind of business of, depending how the net moves, and you can work with that metaphor in loads of ways, but everything is part of everything else. For me, that relates to the idea of negative capability of I think it's Keats says something, I'm sure you know as well as me, about the author always needs to be in doubts about things and being open to. So I kind of see that as negative capability, as the author being like a bucket into which things get thrown. And so again, the idea of at the center of Buddhist sense of self, there is just a reflector. And in terms of kind of negative capability, you are the stuff that fills you rather than the light that comes out of you. I mean, as a teacher, I always the thing I say most and at most tedious length to my students is the writer is an arranger of words more than a creator of words. And that's how I see the way I interact with the world. I've just got stuff that I like playing with. Plays another important part of how I think of being a writer or an artist. I've just got all this stuff to play with.
Great, I love that. The issue of play has been a real through story for a lot of our videos already, and quite a lot of the ways you're describing being a writer also for me describe ways of being a scholar, where often the way we get read and understood is as people who know stuff, whereas actually I feel much more comfortable with the empty bucket scenario where, and the joy of being in doubt and that kind of openness to new discoveries and the process of finding stuff out, rather than the temptations of inhabiting a professional identity which is all about what you already know. So I really love that idea of the kind of discovery and the discovery that comes with things like arranging words, composing and recomposing words.
I think that thing of, again, to kind of simplify things, the kind of traditional poetry which students come to class with, and which is the kind of the dominant mode in conservative mainstream literature, is that, the old kind of cliche of someone saying, I read the poem and the poem, it said what I could not say. And that kind of business of poetry being a vehicle for exploring or articulating what is already known. I'm good with all of that. Of course, it's not either or, but I kind of like the idea that when you read, you come across things that you could never have thought. And also, as when you're creating, I kind of get to the end of a poem. I've got a terrible memory, and that's part of it. And I kind of go, oh, good Lord, I had no idea that was what was going to happen. So again, surprise and discovery is yeah, repeating what you're saying in a way, you know, that kind of idea of you play when kids play, they pick up a banana and it becomes a plane, and then they fly the plane around, and then they drop it, and then it becomes mush. That not knowing what's going to happen next, and not failing. And of course, as creative artists, we all fail in terms of saying we didn't do something wasn't successful for us. But the idea of failure in a traditional sense is something which again is kind of interesting for me as a writer and teacher.
Can you say a bit more about that and what you mean by failure in a positive sense?
I don't know. I guess there's a number of ways you can think about that, in that when I write poems, some of them are discarded. So I would consider them to be failures. So they're not meeting some kind of hope or expectation or potential, if you will, of what I believe could have been got from a piece of writing. So failure as something which you discard, which you weren't able to make whatever satisfying, is one type of failure. The other kind of failure is if something doesn't meet the expectations that you have for it, well, there is a possibility that failure lead onto something else. I suppose what's the obvious one is, I don't know if it's a true story or not, but like discovery of penicillin, right? So the thing failed, created something different, and it was being able to notice that something came out of failure and work with that is a creative thing.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. It's really exciting. I quite often work in forms of research and attempts to discover things, and I often say to colleagues, if it fails, that's great, because that shows that we've conducted a genuine experiment. And I quite often find I get laughter in response to that suggestion, but I'm a huge believer in failure, and a believer in failure as being itself a kind of discovery, which might or might not end up being in the public domain in the way that you're talking about some poems which feel like they failed and don't see any further light, and other kinds of failures which are so creative and exciting in and of themselves that they take you further forward. I've got that right.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, for me, given that my language skills are lousy and I've lived abroad quite a lot of my life, I was always misunderstanding things in other languages. The tradition I come from as a reader and translator, Ezra Pound famously, when he was translating from the Chinese, translated a Chinese poem, and it was pointed out that if he'd been able to read Chinese, he would have realized that they were two completely separate poems, and he had just read them as one and created a single poem out of them. And his response was, fine, I made a good poem. For me, I wear hearing aids. I'm increasingly hard of hearing, so mishearing is something that's always been creative. There's also misreading and mishearing. And there's a book by Richard Brautigan called Trout Fishing in America. And someone said this to me the other day, and I thought they'd called it, they were referring to something called trout fisting in America. And that kind of ridiculous mishearing is always very pleasing to me. Happens all the time, and they're usually, well, the ones you remember are the really stupid ones.
I can't think of a broadcastable reply to what you just said. So yes, okay.
Forgive me.
I remember there's a wonderful history of typos, and I'm being stupid. I can't remember the name of the book, and if we find it out, we'll flash it up on the screen for readers. But there is a history of typos, and one of the glorious examples of that was a book which was about the Candian Navy, i.e. the Navy off the coast of what we now think of as Turkey in the early medieval period. And the copy editor of this book refused to believe there was any such thing as the Candian Navy and turned it into the Canadian Navy. So about 1.5 millennia before Canada came along, its Navy was patrolling the Eastern Mediterranean in this book. So you've talked to us about You described yourself earlier as being clearly an English person, but you've also talked about your very international life and the international reach of your writing, and about your interest in translation from languages in which you don't feel fluent. Could you tell us a bit more about that process? Do you have any examples of some of that work we could hear about?
Okay, yeah. My general method of translation. I grew up, the first poetry that I ever loved was Chinese and Japanese poetry and Little Penguin anthologies. And I was always fascinated by how they were translated and what they must have felt like hundreds and hundreds of years ago when many of the poems I was reading were written. And so my early collections of poetry were more often than not Chinese, Japanese, French, Spanish writers. And so I had quite a large collection of books of poetry. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them were parallel translations. And so I got to the point where I would have maybe 3 different translations of a Japanese haiku. And at that point, I started being really interested in looking at how the translators were approaching the texts differently. And so I was doing this without having knowledge of the original language, in the case of Japanese. In the case of French and Spanish, I would be able to, the same would be the same case, right? I'd have maybe 4 different translations of the poetry of Arthur Rimbaud, and I would look at those translations. I would add to that my working knowledge of French and Spanish, would have a dictionary as well. And so again, going back to that business of the writer being an arranger of words, I was it was like I had I've never thought of it quite like this before, but maybe I had 4 different jigsaws with kind of the same picture, but they were made up of different shapes, pieces of jigsaw. And so that kind of business of thinking, oh, she translated like this and he translated like this, how would it work best for me? And so that kind of business of assembling meaning that's always been my method. It's interesting now in that with the developments in technology, what I've been doing during the lock-in for coronavirus is I've been just doing a translation a day to keep, well, because it interests me, of course. And now you can just use Google Translate on your phone and just hold your phone up to the text and you'll get an immediate translation of any text. And what's really pleasing about that for me is that if you move the phone about a little bit over the text, the words keep changing. So that's another layer of the way translation is always temporal. Again, when I talk about translation with students, one of the things that makes translation really exciting is that there's only ever going to be one version of, well, let's say Shakespeare in English, there will only be one version of Hamlet. But every time Hamlet is translated into Catalan and German and all the rest of it, there are potentially millions of other Hamlets in the world. And in a way, because I'm the person doing the translation, it's those multiple versions which are more interesting to me.
Yeah, I love that. I sort of want to jump in on the idea that there's only one Hamlet in English, because actually what you're saying about its international existence is also true in English, in that there are multiple versions of that play surviving from Shakespeare's lifetime, one of which is half as long as the other. And there's also the version that Shakespeare was rewriting himself. There's an earlier Hamlet play, which does not survive except within Shakespeare's adaptation. So that's there's almost like a butterfly effect to what you're saying, in that that's possibly also true in the other direction as well. And I guess what you're talking about is opening up dialogue in a world which tells us that dialogue requires fluency, right? This is an attempt to translate and move between languages which are not necessarily otherwise our own. That makes sense.
No, absolutely. And of course, the business of, when I was saying that I don't want to have a fixed meaning to my work, everyone who reads Hamlet is reading a different Hamlet too, aren't they?
Yeah.
So again, that kind of business of fluidity and relationship in how we make our way through the world is, you're absolutely right, saying there is one Hamlet. Of course, that's as wrong as saying there are thousands of Hamlets.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Maybe talk through a particular example of some of your work then. You mentioned Petrarch, but is there any particular book or poem you'd like to discuss?
I've got the book in front of me. I think maybe I use, this is the book here, and it's covered in stickers because it is.
Stickers.
What I did, maybe the best thing to do is to talk through kind of number of translation methods that I've used.
Great.
Over the course of about 5 years, what happened was I was invited to just start writing about my translation methods. I had a book which came out in San Francisco in the mid-2000s called Horace, which was versions of the Latin poet Horace. Of course, I don't read Latin either. But after I did that, people kept saying to me, how are you doing this? This is interesting or peculiar or nonsensical. And so this coincided with me getting a job in the academy. And in order to get a job in university these days, as you know, you need to have a PhD. So for my PhD, I catalogued 73, it was 73 because I ran out at 73 different translation methods that I used in the book Petrarch. And so in a way, maybe talking to you about just different methods that I used is probably quite a fun way of talking things through.
Probably discuss all 73 though.
I won't talk about all of them. The kind of most shocking method, I think, to people who don't really know about this, is there's a method which I came across at a party. I was living in New York, and we were having a party, Halloween party of poets, and of course, it was a great party. But we were all talking about poetry, and it would have been boring to anyone who wasn't a poet. And one of the party games was what you do is I called it myopic translation in my cataloging of things. And so what you do is you take a book and you hold it. It doesn't have to be a book, it could be a computer screen. You hold it as far away from you until you can't read what the words are of the poem. And so you look at them, and of course you hold them to a distance where you can tell the long and short words, and you can see the little bits sticking up and sticking down and the rest of it. And then you write what you think you see. And so that's a myopic translation. The poem becomes your short-sighted rereading of the original poem. And so that's one thing I do. I teach a class with that, and we put up one of a colleague of ours, a fantastic poet, Jeff Hilson's poems. I blurred it on the screen, and the whole class writes their short-sighted version of it, and then we read them. And of course, they're all different, and it's very kind of Freudian in that you're drawing from your lexicon that you have in your head. And so what comes out is, it's quite funny because it shows what's going on in the head of the reader. So that's a myopic translation.
Just to check I've understood that and summarize for listeners, but also so you can correct me if I've got this wrong. That's almost removing literacy from your engagement with the poem and forcing you to engage with form and shape and structure and possibly, as you were saying, some letter shaping. And I wonder if there are kind of affinities there from your point of view as someone who works with Chinese in Japanese poetry with an interesting calligraphy and character shape and brushstroke decisions. I don't know if that's something there, some parallels there.
Yeah, absolutely. I as a primarily a poet, I think the business of, it's a generalization, but poets are generally more interested in the physicality of the words themselves and the way things are looking on a page. I've never done this because I haven't been able to, but there are some experimental poets who will look at Chinese poems and will write a poem from what the shape of the, you know, the ideogram suggests to them. So yes, that it certainly is it's about the physicality. You're right. It's a pre-language kind of way of looking at a poem, because people, if they translate a sonnet myopically, it will have 14 lines, and you'll be dealing with the same shape. But yeah, yeah, that's how that works.
Great. Can you give us one more example of translation?
Yeah, yeah. I'll see if I can multitask at this point, so I can find it as well as telling you about it. One other method was with the Petrarch poems. By the time I'd finished translating, the book I translated was called Canzoniere, which was 366 love poems to his real or imagined beloved called Laura. And by the time I got through all of looking at many different versions of Petrarch, my working knowledge of Italian had improved a little bit. With French, Catalan, and Spanish, there's, you know, there are resonances and crossovers as well. So one of the methods, this was a method where whenever I had my list of 73 poems, I thought, oh, I've invented that method. And then I'd find a month later that someone else had done it 400 years earlier. But I'm not sure if anyone did this method. You can see here that there are lots of gaps.
Yeah.
So all I did was I looked at the original Italian poem here, and I just translated the words that I thought I understood. So there are lots of gaps. It begins, there are silences, and when I read them aloud, I have the silences. So it kind of starts with a singing, time passing, the night, month, and so on through the poem. So there are gaps. That relates to another book of mine called 1,000 Sonnets, which was made entirely of very long gaps and maybe 3 or 4 words and dots for the line. And that came out of, again, me not understanding stuff and being a kid and sitting at the top of the stairs and hearing my mum and dad arguing, and I would hear something like, Tim, death, tomorrow. And they'd say, you know, should they be talking about, it'll be the death of me if I ever do that, taking Tim to football again tomorrow. But I would hear all this and that kind of business of imagining what was going on. And that would also tied in with my love of dub music, when words are dropped out from stuff as well. So having lots of gaps again, and misunderstanding and maybe filling in the gaps. Yeah, that's what was kind of working in those ingredients for those things.
That's super exciting. If it's right to start summing up now and moving towards my final question, but I love this idea of engaging with, of forcing the imagination to engage with the gappiness, I guess sensory gappiness. So gaps in what you can hear, gaps in what you can see. And certainly I'm someone who teaches historical forms of poetry, but poetry is probably of the various literary genres, the form which I feel least comfortable, although I have fantastic colleagues to help me with that, of course, Tim. But I certainly tend to teach it as a performance medium, and encourage students to listen to poetry, to speak poetry, and to think about what happens when we read poetry and inhabit it in our bodies. Working as I do in a 16th century English literary culture where poetry was often a mode of performance, right? A mode of entertainment, of live entertainment. And so to hear about how you work with it as a visual form as well, I think is really exciting to hear. But if it's all right to turn to my final question, we're asking our contributors what the word literature means to them, whether it's a useful word to them, an unhelpful word, if it's a word that kind of exists within their professional or their personal lexicon. Yeah, what does that word mean to you?
It doesn't, apart from the obvious kind of dictionary definition of what literature means, I don't think of myself being involved in a world of literature, although I work in a university department which is 50% English literature. I don't think of myself as being able to make a useful contribution with literature in a way, and that's not meant to be kind of negative in any way, but I don't, where you say literature, I kind of would substitute that in my kind of personal lexicon with reading and writing. That's what it would mean to me. And of course, we're talking about different energies here rather than nailed on definitions. Literature suggests in some way a more academic, more I'm trying to kind of suggest the idea of books on shelves, categorization, formal kind of ways of engaging with books. And clearly, if someone else was to say, I think of this as literature is what I love and it's the world I'm in, it will give you just as much pleasure if you call it literature than if you call it whatever, poetry, writing. I don't think about that term. I don't feel for or against it. What literature means to me in terms of books and reading, writing, literature means being really excited to be able to have the privilege of literacy, availability of books, of leisure time to engage with them, and to have gone through my life the absolute privilege of being able to write, talk to people about writing, read and spend time with people who I love, who are extraordinary writers. So on one level, literature's the planet that I live on, and it's a beautiful, exciting planet. I just don't call it literature.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tim. It's been really interesting and fun talking to you.
Pleasure, Andy. Thank you very much for asking. I'm always happy to talk about these things.
Brilliant. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.